Hey everybody, it's Ron, and today I'm going to be reviewing Dune House Harkonnen Issue 1 from Boom Studios. Before I get started, I'd like to point out that I've reviewed all of the previous Dune comics, and you can find them in my Dune playlist if you want to catch up. Okay, so this is an adaptation of the second Dune prequel written by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson. I was pretty happy with House Atreides, the first adaptation. So I was very excited for this book, and I was pleasantly surprised for the most part. I did a video a couple months ago going over some of the preview art when this book was announced, and I thought it looked good, but I wasn't blown away initially, and I ended up liking it a lot more in the context of the full comic. Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson continue their writing duties. It's also illustrated by Michael Shelfer, colored by Patricio Del Pesce, and lettered by Ed Dukeshire. The agricultural zone in this opening page looks really cool, and I could see this type of minimal design used in the Denis Villeneuve Dune movies, so it's a nice page to set the scene. This definitely hits that sweet spot for a comic where the art is cartoony but leaves enough space to get dark and serious without looking out of place, so it's a nice balance. I kind of pretend like I'm watching a Dune animated series anyway with these books, so it definitely works in that way. I also feel like I got a lot of bang for my buck with this first issue because it doesn't leave any of the main players out for the most part. We get caught up with everyone from the last book pretty quickly, and Shelford does a good job aging these characters up a little bit. I always talk about this when I'm reviewing these Dune books, but I can't help it because I read the source material, so I already have these events visualized in my head, and it's pretty 50-50 in this book. For example, the Imperial Palace stuff on Kytane is not how I pictured it at all, but then the underground city on Ix is dead on and looks great in this issue. It was nice to see Jessica finally showing up in these prequel comics, and she gets a nice introduction. I like the choice of having her train, as Mohiam talks about how important she is to the Sisterhood, because it makes an otherwise mundane section very dynamic. My personal favorite sections with these prequels take place on Caladan, and it looks beautiful here. Duke Leto is aged up perfectly, and they foreshadow a couple things very subtly with Prince Romber and Kylea. I think my only real complaint, and it's not a huge deal, but this issue does have a bit of an abrupt ending, and this would be fine as an ending to issue 2 or 3, but I feel like issue 1 needed to have something a little more exciting happen at the end, and maybe I'm just thinking about new readers picking this up as a jumping on point. I feel like there has to be something at the end that makes them want to pick up issue 2 immediately. Issue 1 was a good start, but this issue was way better in my opinion. The great thing about a Dune comic is that you get so much with each issue, since there are so many different characters involved in every story. So it really never gets boring because every couple of pages takes you to a cool location and it keeps things interesting as a reader. This issue starts out on Giedi Prime, and the colors by Patricio Del Pesce are great. I like the way they are keeping that industrial look, but still making it colorful and not dull. I also like the way Michael Shelfer is drawing the Baron because he's just starting to have a decrease in health, so he can't be the full-on Baron that we know from the original novel, and Michael puts that across perfectly with this rendition. The Gurney section was also very strong. For some reason, I get more of a manga or anime vibe here, especially the way Gurney is portrayed. The action is very fluid, and it really sells the tragedy of Gurney's early life. Kytane has also never looked better. It's actually exactly how I picture it. This book is definitely a bit of an improvement design-wise compared to the House Atreides comic that came out before it, because it's way easier to tell Shaddam and the Baron apart now. They both have their own distinct look, and it got a little tricky because the Baron was skinny in House Atreides, and he has red hair, so he looked just like Shaddam in some panels, which made things a little confusing. I especially like the design of the Golden Lion throne as well. The The one spot where the colors become a little more muted is in the underground city of Ix, but it works well because it really shows the hellish existence Kaiter Pilru now lives in. We also get a little glimpse of his brother Demur, who has fully turned into a guild navigator, so that was a cool little tease, and I look forward to seeing this artist's rendition of a navigator. Duke Leto takes Romber to Wallach 9 to find him a companion, and I love this headpiece the Mother Superior is wearing because I definitely like the more adventurous designs when it comes to sci-fi, and things should look a little weird in my opinion. Jessica continues to slowly work her way into the story, and the colors here are great. It was nice to see Yui for the first time in these prequel comics. I think he looks pretty dead on, and I thought the setting was cool as well. I like that we get a nice establishing shot every time the location changes. Yui is tasked with finding a cure for the Baron, and he tells him that the disease was sexually transmitted, which infuriates the Baron, because now he knows Mohiam is responsible. I enjoyed reading about Lankavile in the book, so it was cool to see it represented on the page because it's so different from the other planets in the Dune universe. So once again, this is another really well done issue. This particular issue starts out with Duncan Idaho arriving at Ginaz to train as a swords master for 8 years. The one thing I'll say is it was a little jarring how quickly time seems to pass in just a few pages. I guess this was supposed to be a montage of his training over a few weeks or a few months, and that's fine because I know you have to shorten some stuff in comic book adaptations. So other than that, I liked seeing this location because it's very different from Caladan or Arrakis. One minor art criticism is this panel here of Duncan sparring with his new friend Resser, and it feels a little weak in an otherwise dynamic training section. The stuff with the Baron on Giedi Prime continues to look awesome, and I particularly like the design of the ship they take up to the Highliner. It looks very sinister. The Harkonnens travel to Wallach 9 to retaliate because Mohiam gave the Baron his condition. And this was one of the parts in the House Harkonnen novel that I didn't love. And I feel the same way here because the Bene Gesserit sisters display some abilities that I think go a little over the top. They basically become invisible to the Harkonnen invaders and mess with them as if they're ghosts. And I just didn't buy that they can do this type of stuff. They can also see Raban in the No Ship, and they bring it down basically using the voice. So yeah, personally, I feel like this is all a little too much, and it makes it seem like they have full-on superpowers. The sections with Kaiter Pilru on Ix are kept short, which I think is a good move because it doesn't slow down the momentum of the larger story, but I do like the look of the Tleilaxu. There's another short training session with Duncan Idaho, and I was really happy to see these giant turtles that were described in the book. It's a small detail that probably didn't need to be included, but I'm glad it was because seeing different creatures like this enhances the experience for me and scratches that Star Wars itch where you never know what kind of creature or monster you were going to see from planet to planet. Duke Leto doesn't get much time in this issue, and there's a short conversation with Romber and his new concubine, basically setting up a plan to return to Ix. At the end of the issue, the Baron punishes Raban by sending him to Lankavile to stay with his parents. That whole side story takes up a good portion of the book, and I thought it was pretty ruthless and sad in the novel. Duke Leto and Kylea, their relationship kind of falls apart pretty fast in this. We're only on issue 4, and we're getting deep into, some of the resentment that Kylea has. I always like a good Caladan shot, though. I like seeing the castle. And yeah, it's always just interesting to see these other environments because when you think of Dune, you think of Arrakis and the desert, but there's a lot more to it than that. So it's nice to see in these comics. But speaking of Arrakis, I liked this opening Carthag scene with the Baron. I also like his outfit. It's really cool. There's some kind of like armor on his shoulders, but then it's a normal regular robe. And I think with these comics, since I know the story and I've read the books, I like seeing the designs of everything a little bit more than actually reading it because I do know what's going to happen. So, yeah, it's just more fun to see how everyone is dressed and how they're portrayed in this comic compared to, just some of the subtle descriptions that we get in the books. Piter is basically telling the Baron about a way to infiltrate House Atreides a little bit more. And I don't know how I feel about his little John Lennon glasses there, but it wasn't too bad, I guess. This book definitely makes you feel bad for Gurney. We get his tragic backstory, and he's going to be on a mission soon because somebody sends him a letter saying that his sister is still alive. And he kind of assumed that, but yeah, now I think he's just driven to find her and get his revenge at this point. The Lankavile sections with Raban was pretty hard to read with the book, and this is hard to look at too because he's just so brutal. And his dad, Abelard, he really loves his son, but you can tell he's just been so corrupted by the Baron and the way the culture is on Giedi Prime. So, he's just not going to fit in here at all. And this was another section that I felt really ramped up fast. There's really no setup. He's just mad, and then he immediately goes out and starts hunting whales because they're annoying him. In the book, it was set up a little bit better than that, but I get it. It's a comic book, and you have to kind of move things along at a different pace. The section on Arrakis with Liet and his friend Warwick was pretty interesting because we finally get to see kind of like the Antarctic polar zone of Arrakis. And some of the Fremen travel to this area to give a spice bribe for the guild. But it gets really interesting when they leave because they discover kind of a hidden base, and that's where Dominic Vernius comes back into the fold. If you remember from House Atreides, he was driven out of his homeworld, Ix, because of the Tleilaxu attack, so he's planning his revenge slowly on Arrakis, and everybody thinks he's dead, so he has a lot of time to make something happen. Another huge moment is when the Baron finally gets his suspensor belt. I like that they kind of kept the little back and forth between Piter and the Baron where they basically both want each other to die. Every time they hang out together, they want to kill each other. So yeah, things move very fast in this issue. It is kind of jarring, and it takes it to another level when they decide to skip 2 years later in the middle of the issue, and we're introduced to Victor already. So there are a lot of things being set up, and it is a complex story. There are a lot of characters, there's a lot of moving parts, but they do a good job separating them and making it accessible to even new readers. So I do appreciate that. So with issue 5 here, they had a fill-in artist, and I really like the art in this. I'd have to go back and really compare it to the first 4 issues to see if I like it more, but it looks really great. And I also want to shout out the colors by Patricio Del Pesce. I think they're really great, especially if you buy a physical copy. So this issue starts out with Gurney on his way to find his sister. And I do like that they don't shy away from a lot of the darker aspects of the novel that this is based on. This whole section is done in a way that's not too gruesome, but the certain things that it suggests are very dark, and they even explain how they cut Beth's voice box out in, I guess, what is a pleasure unit of a military base for the Harkonnen soldiers. So this is really dark material. I thought it was well done. I like that they didn't just take out this whole section because it really is crucial to Gurney's development as a character throughout the whole Dune series, as horrible as it is. Then we move over to Arrakis, and Liet and his friend are still with Dominic Vernius, who pretty much questions them about how they found the base so quickly, and he wants their input so that he can kind of hide himself better next time. He also does a little bit of explaining about who he is and some of the achievements he's had in his life, and I like the mention of the Ikazi Revolt, and this is deep Dune lore stuff. And I also like that in the panel he's explaining what that is, you kind of see a little bit of the actual battle in the background. And I like that stuff because these are things that are mentioned in the Dune books, but obviously we never get to see what they look like. So stuff like this is always interesting. On Caladan, we have Duke Leto with his son Victor going on pretty much just like a fishing trip. I like the way his little, I don't know what you would call it, a yacht, or his little pleasure cruise that they're on. It doesn't look too, how can I say this? It doesn't look too sci-fi. I like that things on Caladan are a little more primitive. So it was a good look for the whole section. But of course, this issue has one of the things that I had a problem with in the novel. And it's not the biggest deal, but the idea of the Elecrons, which I've talked about in the House Harkonnen novel review that I have, and then I also talk about it in the Duke of Caladan review for that book, because the Elecron is mentioned in that as well. And it's basically this elemental force or this elemental entity that has to do with the lightning and the water combined. And the captain in this even says that an Elecron is said to be the ghosts of those who died at sea turned into living lightning. I guess that's not really what it is, but it just seems like more of a Star Wars thing to me than a Dune thing, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of the Elecron, but the whole section was drawn really well. And it's probably a hard thing to do because it's really just this elemental force or creature. So it's probably hard to put down on paper. There's also a section in this issue on Wallach 9 with Jessica and Helen Mohiam. And this is a mirror of the Gom Jabbar section of the first Dune novel with Paul, because Jessica is basically getting that same test. Once again, I really like the way this is visualized for the comic version, and I also like some of the panel layouts. It's getting a little creative again. It kind of reminds me of the Dune graphic novels. They have a lot of these type of panels that aren't your traditional layouts for a comic. So that was nice to see as well. I gotta say, this artist draws some of the Ginaz Swordmaster School stuff a little better than the regular artist. And this is the point in Duncan's training where a lot of the other students are faced with a difficult choice because of certain political situations that are happening in this universe. Some of the students end up leaving because of it. Is it the most important thing to this overall story? No, but I thought it was going to be one of my favorite sections of this comic because I enjoyed those parts of the book, but it has fallen a little flat for me. And then we also get taken back to Lankavile. I gotta say, I don't remember this whole avalanche sequence, but once again, drawn really well. And I love the way that Lankavile is portrayed in this comic book. It's pretty much exactly what I pictured when I read the book. So no complaints there. I do really like this art. So I was a little disappointed that we didn't get a lot of the Harkonnen stuff, because I would have liked to have seen what this artist could do with Gidi Prime a little bit more and the Baron and Piter. But there is a nice little scene of them discussing why Raban needs to go back to Lankavile. And then I think it was a really good place to end this issue with Lady Jessica finally getting to Caladan and being introduced to Duke Leto as his new concubine. And obviously that's going to stir up a lot of trouble with his current wife. So we'll see what happens. Well, I mean, I know what happens, but it is a nice place to end in a comic book, because if you haven't read any of the Dune prequels, this would be really cool to set up the eventual relationship between Duke Leto and Lady Jessica for the first time. So that must be interesting for new readers. And I do wonder if there are any people that are reading this stuff with only knowledge of the original Dune novels. I wonder how it reads that way. Let's dive into issue 6 of House Harkonnen. It starts out on Arrakis with Liet and his friend Warwick. And I've said this in my novel reviews of this prequel trilogy, but some of my least favorite parts of those books were the Arrakis sections, funnily enough. But it works a little better for me in comic book form because the tone is very different. The actual art or the cartooning has a slightly humorous bent to it, and at first that doesn't seem like it would fit with the Dune material, but I understand why they made this choice, because as much as I love Dune, it is a pretty dry and serious series of books. So they wisely added some personality and life to it with the comics to make it fit with this visual medium. And it's not like it's goofy, it's just little reactions from the characters, like these panels, for example, that make it a little more fun and a little less drab. So overall, it's a good idea to do this kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean the whole issue is like that, because aside from this opening, it's a pretty brutal read. Raban returns to Lankavile after slaughtering the fur whales, and right after a huge avalanche, he raids a village and kills one of the prominent members in front of his father, Abelard. And it's really tragic to watch his parents react to his evil behavior, not knowing how they went so wrong with their son. This issue is also the final breaking point for Leto and Kylea. They end up getting in a huge fight, and he decides to visit Jessica out of desperation. But what I like most about this section is the narration from Jessica. She's obviously torn between her duties as a Bene Gesserit sister and her more human emotions when it comes to Leto and her feelings for him. The artist Fran Gallen does a good job with the acting here as well, which is important when drawing these scenes of people just standing around. Typically, comics should always have a lot of action and motion to them, but if you're going to have these type of dramatic scenes, you have to make it interesting visually and compelling with the acting. The most brutal and unforgiving part of this issue is when Raban gets back at Gurney for attacking him in the slave pit by killing his parents and then bringing his sister Beth in and making Gurney watch as he rapes and kills her. It's so cruel and horrifying on the page and in the book as well, and it's a moment that defines Gurney moving forward and explains why he hates the Harkonnen so much, and also how he got the Inkvine scar. Is it fun to look at and read? No, but I'm glad the creators don't shy away from what happens in the book. I'll also shout out the coloring here in the exterior slave pit shot. I like the dark purple hues added in, and every location in this book has a very different vibe, which keeps things interesting. The worm that Liet rides in this issue is really great. I love the scale of it on the page. Gallen does a great job here making it look massive and otherworldly with all of the teeth. Warwick and Liet are competing for the love of Ferula, and she tells them that the first person who finds her can marry her. And to me, this is the epitome of filler material. It's just a side quest, but I did feel bad for Liet when he loses. And he's still a good sport about it, which develops his character a little bit. So in one word, I'd say this issue is very tragic all across the board, but it was very well executed. Issue 7 starts out with Kater Pilru on Ix, and Prince Romber has finally given him some weapons to fight the Tleilaxu with. There are some really nice panel layouts here and some good action when Kater finally makes some progress fighting back against the Tleilaxu. Leto and Romber have such an awkward conversation about Kylea because Romber knows Leto is seeing Jessica, and even though he tries to stay out of it, he's also being protective of his sister. I gotta say, I'm not really a fan of Leto's hairdo here. I think he looks a little clean cut, and I think he's old enough to maybe have some facial hair, because that's how I always visualized Leto in the original Dune novel, but I know their portrayal is supposed to be a younger Leto, so it's not that big of a deal. I also liked the turn of events with Liet going on a journey after having his heart broken and meeting up with Dominic Vernius and his smugglers. And I also like this part of the novel as well. It gives his story an epic feel because he's eventually going to change locations when they travel to Seleucus Secundus. Once again, I'm really liking the color choice for the Gideon Prime sections, and it's very satisfying to see Gurney escape. So now some of the characters who previously had nothing to do with each other are slowly coming together. Issue 8 starts with some of the elements that I didn't love in the novel, like Kater using Ixian technology to communicate with his brother Demur, who is now a guild navigator. I just thought it was a little far-fetched, even for the Dune universe, to be able to do this with some scrap material, but oh well. I liked seeing Seleucus Secundus here. It's such a desolate planet, and the artist and colorist make this section more vibrant by giving the characters different color capes and clothes to make it less bland, and I think this is something the Dune comics have been doing better than the new movies. I do have a question about this section, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments if you know the books better than I do, but Gurney and Liet are both on Seleucus Secundus in this prequel, and they meet and talk, so wouldn't they be familiar with each other in the original Dune novel when Liet takes Gurney, Leto, and Paul out in the ornithopters and they see a worm for the first time? The only thing I could think of is Liet is introduced with a different name in this, so that might be a way to retcon this. This whole issue really is the best looking one yet, in my opinion, though. I loved seeing the council on Kaitane. I thought everyone's outfits were great, and I also really liked the way the Gideon Prime parts looked as well. The Baron looks menacing, and the colors are great as always, so yeah, these sections really help immerse me in this world. I'm really digging the different color palettes for each specific section. This issue also has the best part of Duncan Idaho's training on Ginaz, covering his final test, and this lends itself to the comic book medium very well because it's very exciting and action-packed. Poor Abelard and his wife cannot catch a break because as soon as they are starting fresh with a new baby, Raban shows back up to take him away, and this is how Fade Ratha came to be under the Baron's wing, which is really heartbreaking knowing the future of that character from the original book. If he just stayed on Lankavile, he would have been brought up right, but instead he was kidnapped by the Harkonnens, and we all know what happened after that, so it's really tragic. And then if that wasn't bad enough, this issue throws another horrible disaster in at the end with Liet and his friend Warwick getting stuck in a sandstorm, and Warwick gets most of his flesh torn off. But I liked all of these outcomes in the novel because it shows how cruel and unforgiving the Dune universe is. Issue 9 sees the return of Michael Shelfer, the artist who originally started this series, and it looks really good with great colors by Patricio Del Pesce. Some of the best art in the whole issue, in my opinion, is the stuff with Warwick. He looks like a corpse, and then when they wrap him up, he looks like a rotting mummy, and it was all very well done. The Abelard section was still really sad since their new baby was taken from them, and it's even more sad to know for sure that they're never getting him back, from what we know of the original book. He has an idea to take the Baron's spice dash on Lankavile and use it for good, so that's not going to go well for him. The stuff with Dominic Vernius really ramps up, but just like the book, I felt it was a little anticlimactic because we go through all of this prep with him throughout the whole series, and then he just ends up dying and only taking out a couple Sardaukar soldiers. So his whole storyline was kind of pointless, in my opinion. The Ginaz section with Duncan, Idaho looked good as well. I like the environment. It sort of reminds me of Yavin 4 in Star Wars. Kater finds out what the Tleilaxu are actually up to, and they keep it very vague. We don't get to see what the axolotl tanks actually are, so I'm wondering if they actually will show it or just have him describe it instead, because it might be too gruesome to depict in the comic, but then again, they haven't shied away from the other things, so we'll see. Okay, moving on to issue 10, which I think is my favorite of the bunch here that I'm reviewing. And I'll say it again, I think the comics have a lot more style and flair than the movies. I love this guy's pirate style getup on this final section with Duncan, Idaho being kidnapped. And it was an exciting way to start the issue. I also love the huge doors Gurney walks up to as he makes his way to Castle Caladan to meet with Leto. Shelford does a great job with the creature designs, especially the Leza tiger that Dune fans might know from the book Children of Dune, the third novel in Frank Herbert's original Dune series. I love the big vampire fangs, and I also like the design of Giedi Prime as always. And I'm impressed that they kept the original design concepts with the buildings having that red line going through, almost like lava. And that goes back all the way to the first series, House Atreides. So it's nice to see that attention to detail. I don't know if we're supposed to feel sorry for Kylia at this point in the novel and the comic, but she is very annoying and mentally unstable because she tries to orchestrate Leto's demise by planting bombs in his sky clipper. What she doesn't know is that her son Victor goes with his father at the last minute and the explosion kills him. It's really sad and well executed in the books and the comic, but as I said in my book review of this story, it's strange to think that Leto had a son before Paul. I guess Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson wanted to bring some tragedy to Leto's backstory, but it is weird to wrap my head around when I think of the original novel. Issue 11 starts with Liet marrying Ferula after his friend Warwick died, and I know this is a Fremen custom, but come on, Liet, you're just getting your friend's sloppy seconds. Have some respect for yourself. I'm just kidding. Anyway, the coloring of Arrakis is great. The colors are by Patricio Del Pesce, and I think the use of red here at dusk is a nice choice. The Ginaz stuff with Duncan wraps up pretty quickly, and at this point we're all ready for Duncan to return back to Caladan. The stuff with Leto getting the news that his son has died and Romber got injured is handled really well here. There's little black and white flashbacks here, and it's really effective. I also like what they have Romber in. It reminds me of a Bacta tank from Star Wars. There are very cool designs throughout this whole miniseries. The artist, Michael Shelford, does a good job depicting the downfall of Kylia and the madness that comes with losing a son by accident. I particularly like this panel of her leaping out of the balcony. The sequence with Beast Raban is very tragic and evil, and I liked this whole storyline, but it was a little on the nose to have him come up with his nickname. I don't think it needed to be explained why people call him the Beast. It was pretty self-explanatory. But other than that, it was really solid all the way through. I like this page of Duncan returning. I don't know, it's just cool and dramatic. I like his spaceship. I like that it's raining. And as a reader, it almost makes you feel better that Duncan has arrived after all of these tragic events have happened. I also like all of the Yui stuff, and I think he's drawn really well. That's how I pictured him in the books. The Tleilaxu show up to bribe Leto, and I appreciate their design as well. They're very distinct compared to everyone else in the Dune universe, so they have to really stand out. This was a very tight penultimate issue, and this comic continues to be very well paced right up to the end. Issue 12 opens up with something that I had a little bit of a problem with when I read the book. That's when Pardet goes to Plaster Basin, and as soon as he gets there, the place caves in and he dies, and I just thought it was rushed and a quick and easy way for Liet to become the new planetologist to set up the original Dune. The Giedi Prime section is good as always. I love the juxtaposition of the futuristic industrial city and the forest on the planet, and I also like the design of the two pilots with the Baron. It was cool to see Fenring in Arrakeen when he was the spice minister, and I like how Arrakeen is depicted as well. Leto and Jessica's getaway on Caladan is a nice chance to show the planet in all its glory, and I'm glad the artist made it look a little more exotic. The funeral scene is just as heartbreaking as it is in the book, especially with Leto holding on to Victor's Seleucid bull stuffed animal. This series definitely ends on a somber note compared to the previous book, House Atreides, but I thought it was just as good, and I hope they get to finish the trilogy with House Carino, which is a book that I really enjoyed. Let me know what you guys thought if you've read this series, and please be sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content. Thanks for watching.